Welcome back to Carolina Journal Radio. I'm Mitch Kokai. Is the economy doing well? Doing poorly? How can we tell? Well, our next guest offers a perspective that's different from the ones you're likely to see on cable TV and in political press releases. He is Dr. Paul Cwik, Mises Institute Fellow and BB&T Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Mount Olive. Welcome back to the program.
Hi, it's good to be here.
So we're going to talk a little bit about how the economy is performing from your perspective. But first, before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about your perspective in addressing this issue. You come at it from a perspective, as I mentioned, not necessarily the one that you're going to hear from the talking heads on cable TV or read in press releases or even in a lot of columns in the papers. This is one that's based on the Austrian business cycle theory. Tell us about that.
Well, the theory of the business cycle, according to the Austrians, is different than what we see in the mainstream. It has a fairly old tradition. It goes all the way back 100 years, a little bit more than 100 years, and it basically has 5 stages. It says that we start with an injection of credit into the system, usually through a central bank, but it can come from other places. This injection of credit will distort interest rates, which will cause entrepreneurs to behave in a manner which, well, is most typical of them. They're going to invest. But their investments aren't good investments. In fact, we call them mal-investments. They're bad investments. Now, we don't know that at the time. That will reveal itself later. And then eventually this bubble will build. And we've seen a couple of bubbles in the last couple of business cycles. Now, as the bubble builds, it seems like times are great. We have low unemployment, we have high investment, we have high profits. Looks fantastic for everyone. But eventually the party has to come to the end, and there is a crunch. Now, the crunch can take place in one of 2 forms, but it usually takes both forms sequentially. But it starts with the credit crisis, or it starts with a real credit crunch. But we'll have both credit and real resources being squeezed at this upper turning point. And we see that these entrepreneurs who've been doing really, really well, all of a sudden making the same mistake at roughly the same time and on the wrong direction. And the question is why? Well, the answer is because they were fooled. They were getting the wrong signal. And these interest rates and these prices were fooling the entrepreneurs, and now it all comes crashing down in what we call a recession or a liquidation phase. And so the liquidation phase then is where the system has to reassert itself. It has to clear out all of these malinvestments, and that's a painful process. And if we're able to clear out the malinvestments and set a firm foundation, it allows us to grow, which is what we call the recovery. And so those 5 stages, you have the expansion, the malinvestment boom, the crunch at the top, the recession, and then finally the recovery, are what constitutes the Austrian theory of the business cycle.
That is the voice of Dr. Paul Cwik, who is a professor of economics and finance at the University of Mount Olive. So setting the stage with that theory of how the business cycle works, what can we tell about where things stand with the economy today?
Well, we're in a boom, right? I think it's an artificial boom. When will that upper turning point come about? Well, nobody knows. I mean, if we did, we'd be, well, very, very wealthy. That would be wonderful for us.
You wouldn't have to talk to me on the show because you'd be at St. Bart's.
Of course we'd talk to you on the show. This would be fun, right? But what we would see is that unemployment is very low right now. We have relatively low inflation. The interest rates are starting to become a little worrisome. We see the yield curve, which is looking at the different maturities. We have the short end, and then we have the long end. And in a crisis, we see the short-term rates kind of spike up, and they've been starting to inch up. In fact, the yield curve is fairly flat right now, which could lead to an inverted yield curve. And then 4 to 6 quarters later, typically what we see is that we're in a recession. More troubling than that, though, is input prices. And we see that input prices have been steadily rising over the last couple of years. Now, why is this a problem? Because input prices squeeze profit margins. And as profit margins get squeezed, businesses start to turn south. They start to scramble. They start to go bankrupt. And when we see an upturn in the bankruptcy of these firms, that's when we are sliding into a recession.
Given the fact that we're in a boom based on what the theory suggests, and that sooner or later we're going to have this crash, what can or should we do about it?
Do you mean you and I, or do you mean we as the government?
Either one, you and I and the government.
Well, first of all, if we're looking at you and I, what we want to do, what I want to do, what you should do, is to get ourselves out of debt as best as we can. So if you have credit card debt, if you have payments that are, just pay those off. Try to take advantage of the low interest rates right now. Consolidate it all, and don't spend outside of your means. Right, rein it in. I know times are good right now. Don't go crazy. Now, what about for public policy? Well, there's a couple of things that the federal government should be doing. In the monetary side, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, needs to stop printing so much money. Stop expanding the money supply because it's been out of control. Now, why? Why has that been happening? Because they have to support the spending of the federal government. The federal government has not reined in spending. We haven't seen a surplus since the 90s. It's been long overdue. We need to curtail this expansion. And you say, well, why do we have to curtail all this expansion? Well, we're running a deficit of over $1 trillion right now. We have a national debt that's $23 trillion and climbing with no end in sight. It cannot continue this way for lots of different reasons, some of which might be with China and other foreign countries. But just internally, what we want to do is we want to take care of our own house, put ourselves in financial order. And that means cutting back on the spending in all of the forms, the entitlement spending, the stuff that they call discretionary, the non-discretionary, all of it. It needs to be reined in. We're only bringing in $3.3 trillion in revenue. We're spending over $4 trillion. It's way too much. We need to bring that in.
In the brief time that we have left, people who look at the economy and say things are going along pretty well, even if they're right, something along the lines of a recession is going to be coming about in the not too distant future.
Well, it's right. And since times are good right now, we should be in this mode to get our own houses in order. It should be easier for us, both as individuals, as governments, as state governments, and as federal government, to be able to take that growth and pay down any of our debt and get ourselves on firm balance. Because once the recession hits, we will see that all of these activities will become much more difficult to do. Our creditors will be calling for us, and we will lose so much more if we don't take prudent steps today.
Prudent steps today always sounds like a good idea. That is the voice of Dr. Paul Cwik, Mises Institute Fellow and BB&T Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Mount Olive. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been fun.